The motion known as M103 has entered the realm of discussion and debate in Canada's Parliament. M103 was carefully structured to look like an innocent show of solidarity with all victims of racism in Canada, with the casual addition of Islamophobia as a special cause for concern. In fact, for those who crafted the motion, and whether it was MP Iqra Khalid, its ostensible mother, or the Prime Minister's office, I am not sure, since Khalid refuses media interviews, hate crimes against groups other than Muslims were very far from their thoughts. M103 calls for a study of Islamophobia in Canada, but does not define Islamophobia. Does Islamophobia mean animus against Muslims, or does it mean animus against Islam? M103 does not specify, even though the distinction is of dramatic importance in terms of the Western understanding of free speech rights. If this motion passes without significant amendments, much will depend on the findings of the study. Who will be involved in this study? Will it be non-Muslim objective researchers from, say, the Conference Board of Canada or some other respected think tank? Or perhaps researchers with no stake in the issues plucked at random from the sociology departments of our finest academic institutions? Or will the study principles include involvement by individuals from the National Council of Canadian Muslims? I would be very surprised if the NCCM, formerly known as CARECAN, was not a principal actor in this study. If they are, one does not have to be a Cassandra to predict that the study will conclude that Islamophobia is rising at an alarming rate and that Muslim children feel especially targeted for hostility, and that it is therefore incumbent on those who did the study to recommend that Parliament pass a law that imposes limitations on speech regarding Islam. My skepticism regarding NCCM's objectivity is not unfounded. In my observation, it seems that one of this group's principal objectives is to create a state of fear in Canadian Muslims that is unsupported by objective evidence. Let me show you what I mean by taking a little tour of NCCM's history with other allegedly trustworthy studies of Islamophobia in Canada. In 2002, for example, the executive director of CARECAN, that stands for the Canadian chapter of the Council for American Islamic Relations, stated that, quote, a very well documented anti-Muslim hate wave had swept through Canada as a consequence of the 9/11 terror strikes on the U.S. It turned out that by well documented, he meant a small polling of 296 Muslims with questions sent to an in-house listserv rather than a random community sample and with no margin of error reported. Of the 296, 117 people said 9/11 changed their lives for the worse, but 98% their lives had improved in terms of building bridges with non-Muslims and remedying stereotypes. The others had no opinion one way or another. Not exactly evidence of a hate wave. In 2005, the NCCM published results of another survey on Islamophobia, which they entitled Presumption of Guilt. The methodology this time, it turned out, was to make a questionnaire available on the internet, effectively allowing people who'd never set foot in Canada to complain about anti-Muslim bigotry in Canada. It also turned out that more than half the respondents were connected in some way to CARECAN, and a good proportion of them were engaged in Islamic advocacy. In fact, after a minor 2-month post-9/11 spike in anti-Muslim incidents, even these sharply diminished. Out of 1,000 hate crimes in 2002, according to police reports from 12 populous Canadian cities, 25% targeted Jews, who represent a third the number of Muslims in Canada. 17% targeted blacks, 11% targeted Muslims, 10% South Asians, and 9% LGBT. In 2006, the year following presumption of guilt, of religiously motivated attacks, a stunning 66% targeted Jews, while just 11% targeted Muslims. Anti-Semitism still maintains a dramatic lead over Islamophobia in hate crimes, and I am sorry to say that some of those reported hate crimes against Jews, and certainly a great deal of hate speech, have been committed by Muslims, although, to my knowledge, the reverse scenario is never or almost never the case. Just recently, for example, in at least 2 sermons distributed on YouTube, Imam Saeed al-Jitawi of Montreal's Al-Andalus Islamic Center called for Allah to, quote, destroy the accursed Jews, to kill them one by one, and to make their children orphans and their women widows. You will not hear this kind of language used about Muslims by any Jewish community leader or in any synagogue in Canada or anywhere else. And yet, on an institutional level, our cultural and political leaders remain fixated on the myth that anti-Muslim hatred is a source of special concern. So much so that last fall, the Canadian Human Rights Commission, that's the CHRC, teamed up with the NCCM and the rather controversial Islamic Social Services Association to attract funding from the Red Cross in order to produce a guide for Canadian teachers called Helping Students Deal with Trauma Related to Geopolitical Violence and Islamophobia. The guide is troubling, to say the least, and because it is troubling, one has to feel quite concerned about the judgment of such heavy-hitter organizations as the Red Cross and the CHRC in this collaboration. Certain statements in the guide trouble me, such as this, quote, the core values and central tenets of Islam are immutable and the best counter-narrative to the terrorist ideology of hate, unquote. Many Canadians might argue that the best counter-narrative to terrorism is the Sermon on the Mount, rational atheism, or any number of other things. The point is, the CHRC should not be advocating for any particular religious belief system. Then there are flag-raising statements in the guide itself. The guide states that it is apparent that Muslim children are suffering high levels of stress and alienation, but it provides no objective evidence other than vague allusions to community feedback. Are mental health professionals reporting elevated levels of Muslim-specific anxiety? It doesn't say. Raising the question, in future CHRC proceedings, could assertions from this CHRC-approved guide be relied upon by parties to a CHRC process without independent proof of their veracity? The guide rather divisively states that, quote, racial and religious profiling has become acceptable, unquote, when directed toward Muslim youth, but it provides no examples or comparisons with, say, black profiling. The guide suggests Israeli children's suffering receives more media sympathy than Palestinian children's suffering. That is what is kindly known today as a demonstrable alternative fact. But is this now a position held by the CHRC and the Red Cross? If so, such a position has political implications. The guide says special support is needed for Syrian Muslim children arriving in Canada who have been traumatized by their war experiences, without mentioning the war-related trauma of the shamefully few Syrian Christian or Yazidi children allowed into Canada. What message does this send to the latter groups? Most ominously, in its final tips to teachers section, the guide states, generally, some care should be taken by teachers on the language and tone they take when discussing world events and the Islamic faith, unquote. Say again? What does language and tone mean? Wouldn't teachers use respectful language about all religions, and wouldn't they normally speak in a respectful tone? I am getting a very strong whiff here of a warning against saying anything having to do with Islam that might offend the sensibilities of Muslim children or their parents, which could mean just about any comment about Islam at all, and any alleged tone at all. What we see in this guide is, I believe, a kind of draft document for what we will see in the projected M103 study if and when M103 is passed, as I fully expect it to be. This guide should never have been published in the first place, but it appeared to almost no critical review, and the same thing could happen with the M103 study if we are not vigilant. Thanks for watching. Click subscribe to see more Rebel videos.